Fort Snelling Phantom, by T.B. Myers. Solomon Cross. When furniture restorer Solomon Cross is sent to Fort Snelling in May 1866 to restore the late Colonel Morse's mahogany desk, he discovers through the knowing that the desk holds the ghost of a terrible fraud, altered treaty survey documents that transferred 200,000 acres of Lakota-protected land to railroad speculators. Chapter 1. The Commission. The letter arrived on a Thursday in the second week of May 1866, tucked between a bill from the hardwood dealer on Pennsylvania Avenue and a note from Amos Pennington about a sideboard with a cracked pediment. Solomon Cross set the other correspondence aside and held the envelope a moment before opening it. The government used heavier paper than commercial houses, as though authority resided partly in the weight of the medium. He could feel through the envelope the particular stiffness of military correspondence, the gum seal applied with a stamp rather than pressed by a thumb, the careful impersonality of official origin. He had been working since before light. The shop on Ohio Avenue smelled of linseed oil and fresh wood shavings, and the mineral smell of the shellac he had mixed the previous evening, still drying on the walnut panel propped against the side wall. The mortise joint he had been fitting for a wardrobe commission lay open on the bench before him, the tenon cut clean and square, ready for its test fit. Outside, Washington was waking to May. The rhythm of carriages on cobblestones, the distant cry of a bread vendor that rose and fell and rose again 2 streets over, and the particular quality of morning light that belonged only to the first weeks of that month. Direct, pale gold, illuminating the walnut panel so that the grain appeared to move in it. The figure in the wood shifting in the angled light, the way grain always seemed to shift when the angle was right, and the eye was paying attention. 14 months since the last battles in the Carolinas and Virginia, long enough that the city no longer felt like a field hospital draped in black crepe, short enough that the veterans still moved through it with the wary economy of men trained to look for the thing that would kill them, and who had not yet learned to stop looking. Solomon had learned to recognize this wariness when he saw it, the particular set of a man's shoulders in a crowd, the way the eyes moved through public spaces before the face composed itself into whatever expression the moment required. He had known wariness like that in himself. Over the years, for different reasons, in different places, he recognized it as a cousin. He opened the letter. It came from the office of the Adjutant General, Department of the Missouri, stamped with the appropriate seals and dated the 3rd of May. The handwriting was clipped and precise in the way of men trained to military brevity, each word in its place, nothing wasted on impression or decoration. Colonel Marcus Aldrich, commanding officer of Fort Snelling, Minnesota Territory, had been referred by General William Kellogg's office to Solomon Cross, furniture restorer of Washington, D.C., for a matter of professional urgency. A writing desk, mahogany, circa 1850, federal style, had sustained damage of unknown origin and required the attention of a skilled craftsman. Transport and lodging to and from the fort would be provided by the Army. Compensation at a rate to be agreed upon delivery of a written estimate. Below the official language, in a different hand, smaller and slightly hurried, written as though added at the end of a long afternoon at a different desk from the one used for the body of the letter, there was a personal note from the colonel himself. I was told by General Kellogg's adjutant that you did excellent work on the secretary desk at the Corcoran residence. We have a situation here that requires discretion as well as craft. The desk has sentimental and institutional significance to this post, and I am concerned that a local tradesman would not bring the necessary delicacy to the work. I hope you will make the journey. M. Aldrich, Colonel, commanding Fort Snelling. Solomon read the entire letter a second time, and then set it on the bench beside the mortise joint, and went to the window. The Ohio Avenue workshop had been his for 3 years, since old Pharaoh's hands had finally given out, and he had sold Solomon the lease at a fair price, which had surprised Solomon, who had prepared himself to negotiate for something worse. The rent was modest, the location was workable, close enough to the better parts of the city that good commissions arrived from clients who could afford good work, far enough from the fashionable districts that no one looked twice at a black man carrying furniture through the front door. He had 2 apprentices, Marcus, 19, and Eli, 17, both from the freedmen's camps that had dissolved when the war ended, both of whom had discovered in themselves, over the past 2 years of working alongside Solomon, a capacity for precision work they had not known was there. They arrived each morning at 6, and left at 6 in the evening, and were becoming craftsmen, slowly and surely, in the way that things properly tended become what they are capable of becoming. Fort Snelling. He turned the name in his mind the way he turned a piece of unfamiliar wood in his hands, before beginning work. Feeling its weight, considering its character, deciding the right approach. He knew the name, as anyone who had read the papers during the war with attention knew it. The Dakota Conflict of 1862. The mass execution at Mankato on December 26 of that year. 38 men hanged simultaneously from a single scaffold built for the purpose, the largest mass execution in the country's history, carried out the day after Christmas, while a crowd of white citizens watched from the riverbank, some of them cheering. He had read that account in a Washington newspaper in January of 1863, and had needed to set the paper down, and stand at the window for some time afterward. And then the prisoners, 1,700 Dakota civilians, women and children and elders and men who had not fought, and men who had in many cases actively worked to prevent the fighting, held through the winter of 1862 to 1863 in a stockade built hastily below the fort's bluff on ground that flooded in spring and that the November wind crossed without interruption. The missionary accounts described conditions that the Army's official reports consistently characterized as less dire than they were. The mortality figures disagreed by hundreds between official counts and missionary counts. In the summer of 1863, every Dakota person remaining in Minnesota was expelled from the state, their remaining treaty lands thrown open to settlement. Solomon had read these accounts in the way he read all accounts of suffering inflicted by the powerful upon the powerless, as a man who knew the shape of such suffering from the inside, from his own history and his own body, who recognized it not as abstraction or policy or regrettable history but as lived fact, something that had texture and smell and specific dimensions, always individual, always composed of specific people experiencing specific things in specific places. He had known captivity himself, in Virginia, before the war, in a different form and for different stated reasons, and he recognized the structure of it when he saw it described, the way certain patterns remain recognizable across their variations. The war was over. The question now was what came after it, and this question was being answered slowly and badly, and with enormous resistance from people who had lost the military argument, and intended to win the consequential one, the argument about what the country would actually be rather than what it had declared itself to be. He read the letter a third time, and attended this time to the phrase that had been sitting at the edge of his attention without quite presenting itself. A situation that requires discretion as well as craft. A damaged piece of furniture required craft. A situation required something else, something the colonel had been careful about how he had named obliquely because it could not be named directly in official correspondence. Discretion, in the context of a military commandant writing to request a furniture restorer from Washington, meant that there was something at the fort that could not be put in official letters, that required a trustworthy person to come and see it in person and use whatever they could bring to it. Solomon went back to the mortise joint. He fitted the tenon and checked the tightness with his palm. The slight resistance that told him the tolerances were right, that the joint would hold through decades of seasonal expansion and contraction without glue if it came to it. He listened to the wood. Good wood told you things if you paid the right kind of attention, about how it had grown, where it had been stressed, what it was capable of bearing, what would cause it to fail. He had been listening to wood this way since he was 9 years old, when a man named Beaumont in Virginia had set him to sanding walnut, and he had discovered that the grain had something like a voice if you pressed your fingers against it with sufficient patience and intention. The knowing was different from craft instinct. The knowing had come to him the winter he was 16, when he had nearly drowned in an icy creek on Beaumont's property, when he had gone into the cold water and come back from it, changed in a way that had taken him years to understand, and more years to learn to use with the care it required. Objects held impressions. The more an object had been at the center of human emotion and decision and struggle, the more it had been handled by hands, doing consequential and emotionally weighted things, the more it held. A writing desk used daily for years by a man conducting guilty business would hold a great deal of what that guilt felt like from the inside. The anxiety, the calculation, the fear of discovery, the specific cold temperature of deliberate wrongdoing as opposed to the hotter quality of impulsive wrongdoing. He could not testify in court to what the knowing showed him, but it would show him where to look for what courts would accept. He already knew he was going to accept the commission. He would finish the wardrobe by Friday. He would sit with Marcus and Eli and go through the remaining work in detail, leaving instructions that would allow them to proceed without him for 6 weeks. He would write to Amos Pennington to hold new commissions. He would write to Mrs. Calloway to hold his rooms through July. He would write to Colonel Aldrich to accept. And he would write to Tobias Webb, because when a letter arrived from a military officer, promising that a situation required discretion, it was useful to let someone with Pinkerton resources know where you were going before you left. This was a habit he had developed after the Brooklyn Dodger case 3 years ago, which had taught him several things about the value of not being entirely alone in uncertain situations. He pulled a sheet of paper from the shelf above the bench. He dipped his pen. The morning light had reached the far wall of the shop, illuminating the walnut panel he had been curing for 6 weeks. The color of it was deep and layered, warm brown and cooler purple in the grain's direction, the surface still rough but already suggesting what it would become when he had finished with it. He had been looking at this panel for 6 weeks. He knew its character. He looked at it now and thought about Delphine's most recent letter, which had described the quality of the light in her Paris atelier in May, how it came through the skylights at an angle that made the wood on the workbenches seem to breathe, to have a life that was almost visible. He thought about her with a regularity he had not, until recently, allowed himself to examine closely. The correspondence had been going on for 18 months, and it had begun formally. 2 craftspeople exchanging professional observations about furniture of the Federal period and its French influences, and had become something else so gradually that he was not sure when the change had occurred. He had read her most recent letter 3 times before answering it. He read it now in memory, and the phrase she had used to close it was, "I find myself wondering what Washington looks like in May. I find myself wondering about many things from a great distance." He wrote the letter to Aldrich first. He confirmed his acceptance, stated his departure date as the 11th of May, asked about arrangements for transport from La Crosse, Wisconsin, which he understood was the current limit of reliable rail service to the territory. Professional, complete, nothing in it that would seem unusual to anyone who read it except the man it was written to, who would understand that Solomon Cross was coming to Fort Snelling and intended to find out what the desk held, and what the situation required. Then he took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote to Delphine. He told her about the commission. Not all of it, not the parts that were uncertain and complicated, but the essential facts. That he was going to Minnesota, to a fort on the confluence of 2 rivers, to repair a desk and to address whatever a situation that required discretion required. He told her about the fort's history and about the rivers, and about what he knew of the land he was heading toward. He wrote more than he had planned to write and read it back and decided it was accurate and kept all of it. He closed with, "I find myself wanting you to know where I am and what I am going toward, and I hope you will receive this in the spirit in which it is intended." He sealed both letters and set them with his other correspondence for posting. He went back to the mortise joint. He fitted the tenon and pressed the joint together without glue to test it, and listened to the sound of wood accepting wood. That small certain sound of right fit, the sound of a thing being exactly what it needed to be, which was one of the best sounds he knew. He thought, "I will come." He thought, carefully, one thing at a time, the way all good work proceeds when it proceeds well. Chapter 2. Webb's Visit. Tobias Webb arrived 2 days later in the way he always arrived. Unannounced, stepping through the workshop door without knocking, ducking his considerable height, for the lintel he had by now learned was precisely his height, his hat already in his hand before he was fully inside. He wore the dark grey suit that Solomon had come to associate with Webb in his working mode. Not his best suit, not a traveling suit, but the suit of a man who was going to places today and doing things there. On his jaw, the scar from the Baltimore case the previous autumn, which he had described to Solomon in 3 words and then declined to elaborate on. Solomon had not pressed. With Webb, what was offered, and what was not offered, and this was workable between them. "You're going to Minnesota?" Webb said. Solomon looked up from the drawer he was dovetailing. The May window gave good light, the bench was clean and well organized, and the dovetails he'd been cutting were precise, the cuts straight and the angles consistent. "I sent you a letter 3 days ago. I received it in Baltimore, and came directly here from the station." Webb surveyed the shop, with the habitual attention he brought to every room he entered. Not anxiously, but systematically. The exits and corners, an arrangement of tools noted and filed alongside everything else. Minnesota is a considerable journey. I'm aware of the geography. What do you know about the fort and the situation there? He asked this the way he always asked preliminary questions, not to test, but to calibrate, to find where to begin without covering what didn't need covering. Solomon set down the chisel and told him. The fort's history, the Dakota War, the Stockade Winter of 1862 to 1863, the expulsion in 1863, what he knew of the current commandant from the letter. He was precise and unelaborated, which was the register. Webb responded to best. Neither too much context nor too little, each fact in its right place. Webb listened without interrupting. When Solomon finished, Webb pulled a wooden crate near the bench and sat on it, which was his custom in the shop when he intended to stay for a while. He set his hat on his knee and looked at the bench and began to tell Solomon what he hadn't known. Aldrich is reliable, he said first, because that was what mattered most to establish at the outset. Regular Army, West Point class of 1847. He served in the Mexican War and then in the Western Theater during the recent war, under Sherman's command. He's honest in the specific, harder way. Not generally honest, which is the easy kind, but honest in a posting that has been actively working to make honesty difficult, and he hasn't been bent by it. He took the Fort Snelling posting in January of this year, when the previous commandant died. Webb paused. Edwin Morse, 53 years old, officially died of heart failure in December. Before Fort Snelling he was posted in Kentucky, and before that a career in the regular army that was unremarkable in both directions. He never distinguished himself, and he never failed catastrophically, and he was patient. He waited 20 years for the right opportunity. And found it in Minnesota. The land situation in Minnesota Territory has been unstable since the Dakota expulsion. The treaties with the Dakota and Lakota were never cleanly administered. The boundary surveys were conducted under time pressure, by surveyors with inadequate instruments and strong incentives to move quickly, and the resulting records were distributed across multiple locations in a way that created opportunities for inconsistency and manipulation. The original survey documents were held at Fort Snelling, which was the administrative center for the territory. Copies were filed with the Land Office in Washington and with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The treaty copies maintained by the bands themselves were characterized by the government as unofficial, which meant they were given no legal weight in any proceeding. Webb organized his thoughts in the visible way he had, a slight pause of a man sorting a large body of information for efficient presentation. The mechanism for the fraud is straightforward in concept, though it required considerable setup and the cooperation of people in several different offices. If you alter the Washington copies to show the boundaries of treaty-protected territory somewhat east of their true positions, opening land to settlement that should be protected, and then also alter the Fort Snelling originals to match the Washington versions, you eliminate the point of documentary comparison. You then work to suppress or dismiss the independent band records as legally irrelevant. The result? Approximately 200,000 acres of Lakota treaty-protected land that appears, on every official government document, to be legally available for settlement and land grant purchase. With Croft positioned to acquire those grants at low prices and resell them at considerable profit, Solomon said. Exactly. Elias Croft is a St. Paul land dealer who has been in Minnesota Territory since 1861. He made legitimate money in the first wave of settlement and has been patient since the legal market for available land tightened. He tried a similar scheme involving military road land grants in 1863 that collapsed. We don't fully understand why, possibly because someone with authority became aware of it before it was completed, and has been positioning himself since for a larger opportunity. He found it in Morse. Webb's voice remained even throughout this, the tone of a man presenting documented conclusions rather than speculating. Harold Nance manages the Bureau of Indian Affairs side of the scheme. He was transferred to the Minnesota posting in the spring of 1864, at exactly the same time that Morse arrived at Fort Snelling. This is not a coincidence, it is a coordination. Before that, Nance was in the Bureau's Washington office, processing land claims and grant applications, which gave him a detailed working knowledge of exactly how those systems operated and where they were vulnerable to manipulation. He and Croft knew each other in Washington before the war, through a land investment consortium that conducted legitimate business on the eastern seaboard. 7 years of relationship, which is a solid foundation for the kind of trust this scheme required. and Hartley found what Morse was doing. Captain Samuel Hartley was Morse's aide, which gave him access to everything: the files, the correspondence, the desk, the records office. He was an educated man, West Point, and briefly law school, before he took his commission, which shaped how his mind worked. He was methodical, the kind of man who noticed discrepancies in documents and followed them wherever they led, even when following them was inconvenient. He began noticing inconsistencies in the fall of 1865, specifically after Two Bears Rising submitted a formal petition through the fort that Nance had failed to intercept before it reached Hartley's hands. Hartley compared the boundary descriptions in the petition against the fort's survey documents. They didn't agree in ways that were systematic and directional rather than random. He kept following the inconsistency. He compared more documents. He found the pattern of alterations. He confronted Morse in November of 1865. Morse died in December. Aldrich arrived to take the posting in January. 3 days after Aldrich's arrival, Hartley rode out on the river road in the morning, and his horse came back riderless at dusk. The workshop was quiet for a moment, except for the sounds of Ohio Avenue outside, a wagon on the cobblestones, the brief exchange of a transaction at a nearby stall, the distant rhythmic sound of metalwork from the ironmonger 2 streets away. "And the remains found downstream," Solomon said, "were insufficient to confirm the cause of death or even the identity with the certainty that official determination requires." Webb looked at his hat. "And there is one second-hand account, from a trapper who supplies the Fort Sutler's store, of a man matching Hartley's description, seen near an abandoned trapper's cabin on the river road, 12 miles south of the fort. The cabin has been unoccupied since 1863, when its owner died. The trapper mentioned seeing smoke from it in passing, mentioned it to the sutler as ordinary news, and the sutler mentioned it to Croft." He paused to let this settle. "Croft has had the river road watched since March." "Then Hartley can't safely come out on the river road," Solomon said. "But a furniture restorer traveling to the fort on ordinary army business would have no reason to be watched by anyone with Croft's interests, particularly one who occasionally traveled the river road in company with a sergeant who knew the local area and had legitimate reasons to be on it." Webb met Solomon's eyes. "Sergeant Owen Doyle. He has been at the fort for 6 years and has seen everything that's happened there. He's reliable in a way that has been confirmed by time and observation. Croft's people have assessed him as unambitious and not a threat to their interests. He has cultivated this impression deliberately because he has been waiting for someone to arrive whom he could give what he knows to." A pause. "He knows you're coming. I arranged it through the fort's supply dispatch, which passes through channels Croft doesn't have visibility into." "And Two Bears Rising?" "A Hunkpapa Lakota elder, one of the senior figures of his band. He has been attempting to have his people's case heard in Washington for more than a year. Nance has been systematically stalling him. Vikeri Noisahak, misdirecting correspondence, manufacturing procedural objections, losing petitions in the bureaucratic process in ways that look like clerical error. Two Bears Rising is planning to appear at Fort Snelling in person in early June, probably within 10 days of your own arrival, with documentation of the treaty boundaries that his people have maintained independently of any government document system. He keeps records. His people have kept records. If those records are compared against the altered surveys at the fort, the fraud becomes demonstrable in a way that can be presented to legal authority." Webb's voice remained even. "He is also, for this reason, the primary remaining obstacle to the scheme's completion. Men who have killed twice to maintain this scheme will not regard one elderly Lakota man with records as an obstacle they cannot address." The afternoon light had moved in the workshop. The walnut panel on the side wall was in a different angle of illumination than it had been when Webb arrived, the grain showing different aspects in the changed light. Solomon had been watching it change while Webb talked, not because he was distracted, but because watching the light change on wood was a habit so ingrained it happened alongside everything else he did. "You've been working on this for some time," he said. "Pinkerton has had an interest in the territory's land situation for nearly 2 years. Instability in the territories affects commerce, and commerce is what Pinkerton's clients primarily care about." Webb set his hat aside. "I'm not asking you to be my agent, Solomon. You understand that clearly. You're going as a furniture restorer, which is what you are. If you observe things while you're there, and communicate what you observe to me, I would find that valuable. But this is not a contracted assignment. You're telling me things that assume I'll observe carefully. I'm telling you things that will help you stay safe, which requires careful observation. The brief silence between them that served as acknowledgement of what they both understood, without stating it. Marcus Todd at the Pinkerton office in St. Paul has more current intelligence than I do. He's been watching the situation closely from close range. He'll meet you before you go up to the fort. He'll give you what he has. If Hartley is alive and has evidence, he needs two things, Solomon said. He needs to know it's safe to come forward. And he needs to know that what he has will actually be used. That it will reach the right hands and produce the right response. He cannot know either of those things from a hiding place on the river. No, Webb agreed. He cannot. Which is the situation you'll be going into? He stood, which was his signal that the essential had been covered. He put on his hat and adjusted it with the precision he brought to all small actions. Be careful, Solomon. 2 deaths already attributed to this scheme, and both were men who had found the evidence and moved toward using it. The distance from Washington to Fort Snelling is also the distance from whatever systems of accountability exist here. Keep that in mind. He left. The door closed behind him. Solomon stood at the window and looked at the alley below, where a dray horse stood with its head lowered and its eyes half closed, while its driver conducted an extended argument with a merchant about the weight of a delivery. The horse had the quality of a creature that had learned to be elsewhere, internally, while its body occupied a situation it couldn't leave. Solomon recognized this capacity. He had practiced versions of it, in various circumstances over the years. He went back to the dovetails. The work was good, and it was here, and it was real, and he had learned over the years that it was useful to stay close to what was real when the work ahead was uncertain. The drawer fit precisely. He pressed the joints together without glue, and listened to the sound of wood accepting wood, the small, certain sound of right fit, the sound of a thing being exactly what it needed to be. He thought about a captain hidden in a cabin 12 miles from a fort, holding evidence in his hands that he couldn't use alone. He thought about an elder traveling toward that same fort, with records that were the surviving true documentation of a fraud that had been carefully constructed to have no surviving true documentation. He thought about the dead man's desk, and what it held in its grain. And he worked. Chapter 3. Preparations. He spent the remaining days before departure in the deliberate way he approached all work. Systematically, one thing fully finished before moving to the next, each step completed rather than merely started before the next one began. The discipline was not anxiety. It was the practiced logic of a man who had learned that the quality of an arrival depended largely on the quality of a departure, and who applied this principle to physical journeys with the same commitment he applied it to craft. The Wardrobe Commission went to the client on Friday morning. The Grants of K Street, Mr. and Mrs. Elias Grant, who had ordered the piece 3 months ago through Amos Pennington's referral. Their KKU had the particular bewilderment of people who had expected a white craftsman and received a black one. The recalibration was visible in their expressions, a moment of surprise, the adjustment to a category their expectations had not prepared, and then the professional courtesy that people of their station maintained even when surprised, because professional courtesy was part of how they defined their position, and they were not willing to compromise their position even in the service of surprise. Solomon moved past it. He had considerable practice moving past it. But they were people who valued their possessions enough to inspect them honestly, and the inspection of the wardrobe was what mattered. Mr. Grant opened and closed each drawer in sequence, checking the action with the thoroughness of someone who understood that drawers that worked correctly today should still work correctly in 20 years. Mrs. Grant ran her fingers along the drawer fronts in the way Solomon had seen clients do hundreds of times, the index finger at the joint between drawer front and case, pressing slightly, feeling for the precision that distinguished excellent work from merely adequate work. She pressed at the lower corner of the large right drawer, and felt the give and stop of a perfectly fitted drawer in a perfectly fitted case, and something moved across her face. Surprise, recalibration, and then something that was not quite appreciation but functioned as it. She paid the invoice at the stated figure, without negotiation. This was the response Solomon considered the highest professional confirmation. Not praise, not comment, simply the judgment that the work was worth exactly what had been asked for it, and no less. He walked back from K Street in the May morning, through streets busy with the commerce of a city rebuilding itself after 4 years of being organized entirely around the possibility of its own destruction. The quality of the city's attention had changed since the war ended. Less vertical, less focused on disaster, more horizontal, more occupied with questions about what came after. These were good questions, mostly. Some of them were being answered badly, with the organized resistance of people who had lost the military argument and intended to win the consequential one, the argument about what the country would actually be rather than what it had declared itself to be. He read the newspapers closely enough to know the state of this larger argument, and to understand that the frauds he was traveling to address were not separate from it. They were downstream of it, particular local expressions of a general logic. He thought about the difference between work that was adequate and work that was good, which was a distinction he had been turning over since he was 9 years old, when Drummond, the head carpenter in Beaumont's Virginia household, a man who had no obligation to teach a slave child anything and who taught him anyway, out of some private conviction about what knowledge was for and who had the right to it, had first put it to him directly. The difference between adequate and good, Drummond had said, is the sum of 1,000 decisions you make when no one is watching. He had been 45 years old then, missing the first joint of his left index finger from an accident with a table saw, with hands that were rough and precise simultaneously in the way of craftsmen who had been doing careful work for many years. What he taught Solomon over 3 years in the Beaumont workshop was not just technique but the philosophy of the work, the idea that the thing itself was the measure, that the quality you put into what no one would see determined everything that was visible. That idea had stayed with Solomon through everything that came after. Through his escape from Virginia at 19, the 7 days north through terrain he navigated by memory, and the instruction of a man he'd met once. Through the years in Philadelphia learning from the journeyman cabinetmaker Estes, who had his own demanding standards and applied them to Solomon's education without softening them on account of his background, which Solomon had found both fair and uncommon. Through the war years in Washington, when the Freedmen's Bureau's legal work had occupied half his time, and the other half he'd spent building his craft reputation through work. That spoke for itself, because in Washington in 1862, the other methods were unavailable to him. Through the Brooklyn Dodger case, and its aftermath. Through the 3 years of building the Ohio Avenue workshop into what it now was, a place with a reputation that brought good clients, where 2 young men were becoming craftsmen. The work itself was the measure. Everything else was secondary or tertiary or further out. Friday afternoon he sat with Marcus and Eli at the main bench and went through the outstanding commissions. He had written instructions for each one, but he didn't read the instructions aloud. He walked through the reasoning instead, as Drummond had done with him, what each piece needed and why, the order of operations and the logic of that order, where the risks were, and what the signs of those risks materializing would look like. The chair with the cracked splat, the replacement element was already milled from matched walnut, sitting on the side shelf. The critical thing was fitting the new piece to the existing, before any final shaping. The fit was the foundation, and the shaping had to follow from the fit, rather than the other way around. If you shaped first, you constrained the fit, and the constrained fit was a compromised joint, and a compromised joint would fail. The dining table with warped leaves. The warp had been caused by uneven humidity during storage, and reversing it required patience. Moisture and weight applied over several days, not forced quickly. Forcing quickly would crack the wood at the figure, the most visually prized part of the piece, which would be both structurally damaging and commercially catastrophic. The slow process was the right process. He had been saying variations of this for 20 years, and it remained true. The chest of drawers with hardware and refinishing. The hardware was ordered and would arrive within the week. The refinishing required 3 days of proper drying time between coats without exception, and the temptation to hurry it would be strong, because Marcus in particular had a tendency toward impatience in finishing work, which was the one area of craft where impatience consistently produced visible results, and not good ones. He looked at Marcus. 3 days between coats, not 2.5. Yes, sir. The Georgetown secretary, Solomon said. Leave it for my return. The lawyer said he wanted it by June, Eli said. A wrong assessment is worse than a late one. If you assess a piece incorrectly, and the client makes decisions based on that wrong assessment, the damage follows for years. The wood will tell us what it is when I have time to read it properly. That secretary has been in that family for 3 generations, and has something going on in the lower left drawer. that I haven't fully understood yet. I won't rush an assessment to meet a schedule. Tell him July, and if he presses, tell him that certain work cannot be rushed without risk of permanent damage, which is true, and which he will receive as reasonable because he cares more about the piece than about the date. Yes, sir. One more thing, and this matters most. If anything comes up that the instructions don't cover, anything at all, set the work aside and wait. Come back to it when you've thought it through, or when I'm back. A commission delayed is recoverable. Work done wrong from the wrong starting point is not always recoverable, and the wood will show it for decades after the mistake. He looked at both of them. You are both better craftsmen than you were a year ago. You will be better craftsmen when I return than you are now. Trust the process, trust the wood, don't force anything. He left them with the written instructions, and the knowledge that Amos Pennington would answer questions in his absence, and went to write the letters that needed writing before he could leave. To Mrs. Calloway, asking her to hold his rooms through July, she wrote back the same evening in her brisk, organized hand. Laranay, she had a quality of dispatch that Solomon admired in the abstract, and relied on in the specific. The ability to see what needed doing and do it without spending energy on the ritual of considering whether to do it. Of course, Mr. Cross, your rooms will be properly aired before your departure, and again before your return. If you need to extend your absence, write, and I will hold them. Travel safely, and be careful. Mrs. Calloway was not a woman who added "be careful" to correspondence as social form. She meant it as direct instruction, and he received it as such. He walked the letter to Amos Pennington's warehouse on Maryland Avenue rather than posting it, because there was more to say than a letter conveyed efficiently, and because Pennington's specific knowledge of political and commercial affairs in Washington was worth the walk. The warehouse in the early evening had the quality Solomon had come to find comfortable over 3 years of working with Pennington. The furniture arranged in the available light, each piece in its particular state of acquisition or repair or assessment, the whole space organized to a logic that was entirely Pennington's own and which, once you had spent enough time in it, was entirely rational. Pennington was a light-complexioned black man in his early 50s, freeborn in Philadelphia, who had built his Washington practice through 20 years of genuine knowledge and strategic patience and the careful cultivation of relationships with clients, who could use what he offered and who, over time, came to understand that what he offered was worth what he charged for it. He and Solomon had a working arrangement, commissions shared, clients referred, information exchanged, and beneath the arrangement, the mutual recognition of two men who had arrived where they were through routes that required more than the situation theoretically demanded, and who understood each other accordingly. Minnesota, Pennington said, when Solomon had explained the commission. He was examining the bracket feet of a mahogany sideboard with the automatic attention of someone who processed tactile information continuously, even in the middle of a conversation. A long way to go, but the situation there. I've been watching the land grant applications through a contact in the Interior Department. The filings are internally consistent in a way that suggests systematic falsification rather than individual error. Individual errors don't match each other. These match in a way that says they were produced from the same altered source. 2 Bears Rising's records, Solomon said. Yes. Pennington set down the magnifying glass he'd been using on the sideboard's patina. If those records survived, his independent survey records from before the 1863 treaty, and if they contradict the official filings at the fort, you would have a comparison that demonstrates the falsification without relying on any document that could have passed through Croft's hands. He looked at Solomon steadily. I can reach a man named Rogers in the land office who has been trying to build this case for 2 years without the piece he needs. If you find something in Minnesota, write to me directly before writing to anyone else. I'll get it to Rogers through a route that won't be anticipated. He paused. How much does Aldrich know? Enough to bring me there. He knows Morse was corrupt and that Hartley found something before he died. He believes the desk holds evidence. He can't move against Croft and Nance without proof he can present through official channels that haven't been contaminated. Then he needs what Hartley has, and Hartley needs to be able to bring it. Pennington moved to a different section of his stock, continuing his evening assessment with the efficiency of someone who never fully stopped working. Be careful, Solomon. Men who have built schemes of this scale, and who have already made the calculations that killing requires. There is no second harder calculation after the first. The first one opened the door. Everything after it is easier. He walked home through the early evening streets, The long May light on the broad avenues, the trees in full leaf and smelling of growth, the particular smell of May in Washington that he had come to associate with the best of the city. Its ambition, its promise, the moments when the gap between what it declared itself to be and what it was seemed temporarily closable. He thought about Two Bears Rising, traveling toward a fort that had been a prison for his people's relatives 4 years ago, carrying his records in the formal dignity of someone who still believed the legal machinery was capable of honoring its own stated principles. He understood this belief intimately. He also understood what it cost to maintain it through repeated evidence that the principles were being actively circumvented by people inside the machinery itself. On Sunday he packed. He chose his tools with care: chisels of 3 widths, 2 gouges, a scraper, a smoothing plane, the mixing equipment for filler and finish, stains and shellacs in small quantities, his notebook and pens. He set aside the Dakota history with its marginal notes, added a natural history of the upper Mississippi region he had found at the bookseller on Pennsylvania Avenue. He sat at his room's desk and wrote to Delphine, a longer letter than usual, telling her about the journey and what he knew and what he suspected about where he was heading. He kept all of it when he read it back, because it was accurate and because he had decided some time ago, keenly, that accuracy with her was worth the risk of it, which was a decision he was still settling into but which felt increasingly correct. He sealed it, and set it with his correspondence for the Morning Post. He went to bed early. He lay in the dark listening to Washington's night sounds, the carriages diminishing as the hour advanced, the distant voices on the street below, the particular quality of a city at rest that was always also already beginning the next day, and thought about a desk in a fort above 2 rivers, and what it held, and what the knowing would find in it when he placed his hands on it for the first time. He thought about how to approach what he did not yet know. Carefully, he thought. Carefully and steadily and without pushing past what the situation required. He slept.